Now, I don't know about you, but over the years I've developed quite an admiration for early industrial revolution engineering. You know, pump rooms full of polished brass fittings, pistons that move up and down and in and out with precision and craftsmanship, where you can see all the workings and that are in themselves quite beautiful to look at. Well, that's about where it ends for me, but for others there's a whole movement that brings this kind of aesthetic into the present day, and they are the Steampunks. Some of them get around in neo-Victorian gear, complete with top hats and brass goggles and leather bustiers and bustles, but also if you're just a bit of a DIY tinkerer, you know, someone who enjoys putting together bits and pieces of stuff out in the back shed, well, you just might be a steampunk too. So what's this all about? Suzanne Donisthorpe is speaking to Catherine Wilson from the Institute for Social Research at Swinburne University of Technology, who writes and researches on this subject.
When people talk about steampunk, they're usually referring to a style, a neo-Victorian style. So if they're talking about a steampunk technology, they might be talking about a contemporary gadget that has been reimagined according to Victorian principles. So it might run on cogs, it might have pistons, it might be encased in brass. If they're talking about a fashion, they're probably talking about corsetry or fob watches or monocles or that kind of thing. So it's kind of a romantic, nostalgic style.
And there is a kind of philosophical underpinning too, isn't there? Or there can be. Neo-Luddite, sometimes they're called.
Some aspects of steampunk are neo-Luddite. I mean, steampunks do work according to artisan rather than mass production principles. But I think for many, it's really about the joy of creating, and it's about a whimsical aesthetic rather than any grand manifesto.
But Luddite isn't a pejorative term, is it? I mean, some people think that may be, but they embrace it.
Look, some do, some don't. Luddite has got a lot of bad press over the years. It is generally a pejorative, but many historians have sought to disabuse people and have presented the original Luddites as in fact skilled artisans, not people against technology, home-based technologists. And steampunks are home-based technologists. They often tool with technologies. They're into hardware hacking, so they're into hacking into the material world. They see the material world as a hackable platform, and in that way they are kind of reclaiming this sense of agency over what they do, which is what the original Luddites in the historic understanding of the term did. They didn't set out to be machine breakers, according to many historians. They simply wanted to reclaim that sense of personal agency and dignity over the technologies they used.
So it's not low tech, it's more slow tech, like slow food, like slow TV, that kind of thing. But when you did your research, you found that people in the steampunk movement were often in IT.
Yes. Most of the people I talked to were in IT, and most of them were educated. And I thought that was really interesting because, you know, if you consider steampunk just as a style, you would inevitably ask, well, why are these, you know, people who have a reputation for nerdism and stylelessness engaging in this? Yeah. And I think it's perhaps because these people are dealing every day with high-tech forms, and so they're in a really good position to critique technology and to look at technology historically, and that's what steampunk claims to do.
But by the same token, it is also not necessarily quite as deep as that. It's a bit of a dress-up party. There's a lot of fun to be had. It's got a lot of people doing DIY tinkering. It's not really quite the bohemian counterculture that some people claim it is.
I don't see it as a counterculture at all. I don't see it as oppositional. The steampunk people I spoke to are just as likely to get their components from Bunnings as they are to salvage them. There are people in the movement who are very committed to salvaging. They range across the whole spectrum. Some people argue, well, if it's not made out of found objects, then it ain't steampunk. Or if it doesn't run on steam or pedal power or wind power, then it ain't steampunk. And you get the full spectrum. Other people just like the aesthetics and the psychological sanctuary of tinkering. But you do see steampunk in a range of mainstream forms. I mean, the movement emerged from so many disparate forms. It emerged from historical reenactment, it emerged from goth, it emerged from 1990s sci-fi, where it was first conceived as in opposition to cyberpunk. And you'll remember the cyberpunk figure from the 1990s. Here was this new celebration of the nerd who did really cool things like software hacking. But steampunks do the hardware hacking, and while cyberpunk was dystopian, steampunk was really utopian and embraced the Victorian ideals of romance and
awe.
Yes, and awe,
Yeah.
and discovery and engineering and the trope of the heroic lone inventor. It really is quite mainstream.
But there's also a sense that you can be co-opted into the environmental movement, because there's an element of the dystopia of reality. The climate change scenario that is descending on us is scary, and it's brought about by high-tech carbon-loaded fuel systems, which we are questioning. So there's an element of it back to a kind of simpler time, a sense of when we didn't know it all, when we didn't have all the answers, and when we found the answers, they were exciting rather than depressing like they are now. When you look at science, it's scary, but in the Victorian times, it was marvellous and wonderful. So in some ways, that is a kind of alternative vision, don't you think?
Yeah, one of the people I spoke to characterised it as an extension of the historical reenactment movement, in that people are living their fantasies rather than acting them out. And in that way they're salvaging equipment, they're giving it romance, they're holding up the product cycle from cradle to grave. So in that way they do see themselves as addressing some environmental concerns. But in my work, I found that what motivates them is more a romantic engagement with the material world.
And the joy of making things.
Yeah.
And talking about joy and making things takes me immediately to where else but the circus, and to Circus Oz specifically. And Daryl Cordell is the set designer.
I just felt that the steampunk fitted the circus world for a number of reasons. One, I thought that it was a little bit left of centre, and that the circus population is a bit outside the general community. But it was also very, very much about the self-inventiveness and the making.
The DIY.
The DIY element to it, yeah. Because all of the people, all of the performers that work at that circus are all skilled, multi-skilled, and they make their own props quite often, and so it just seemed to fit.
So Circus Oz has been steampunk for a lot longer than it probably even
without knowing,
knows.
Yeah, yes. Without knowing, perhaps, yes.
And Daryl's masterpiece is a huge industrial turbine that hangs ominously over the band, snorting steam.
The turbine is the main driving force in the show. It's the source of power. It's the thing that drives all the other elements on the set. And the initial idea was that the turbine, which has lots of steam coming out of it, is an extremely powerful machine that drives a pump similar to a mine derrick that you might see on the oil fields. Now, the derrick in turn drives a converter, which then goes to what I call the teasmade, which is a small steampunk implement on wheels that actually makes a cup of tea. So the entire purpose of that turbine is to make a cup of tea.
And when you were making this, did you have to search through all the various places to find bits and pieces, or how did you construct it?
No, only one place, Bunnings, because everything's made out of plastic and then treated with various forms of paint. So it's the people at Bunnings think I'm quite mad because, yeah.
So there's nothing in there that comes from, I don't know, a disused junk shop that you kind of added on as a piece of original...
No, it's all self-invented, and it has to be light. It has to get up onto that huge tower, and so it has to be light because there's a piano player standing under it. It has to be... so yes, it's all plastic. It's all magic. So.
The magic of Bunnings.
The magic of Bunnings, yes.
Laurel Frank is the costume designer of Circus Oz and another joyful maker. But how to adapt steampunk Victoriana with its bustles and frock coats and fob watches and top hats for a bunch of twirling acrobats and anarchic clowns and somersaulting fire eaters?
Forget it, I think, was basically my starting point. There was a lot of negotiation with each performer about what kind of accessories I could give them, what elements of the style I could bring in that they could work with. With circus, there's always that level of negotiation of, are you turning a somersault? Are you working on a piece of gear that you're going to be brushing against? Are you standing on someone's shoulders? And so everything that they're wearing has to take that into account, or people just simply can't wear the things or stop wearing them after one rehearsal. So, I really do spend a lot of time with people saying, do they stand on the left shoulder or the right shoulder, and do they grab you just around the wrist or, above the elbow, so that I can then go back and draw up what I think is going to work technically and aesthetically as well. And then I represent that to the performer and to the director and get the feedback, and then I go back and restyle or rework or just go for it. So, yeah, it's a heady process, the design for circus. I think there's always got to be that involvement. You can't do it 6 weeks ahead because you have to know exactly what the person is going to be doing.
And that kind of evolves as the circus does. You don't know that beforehand, so you've got to kind of work out what they do when they know.
Yes. Yeah. And I just haunt people all during the rehearsal process, and I wrestle them down, and I'm not using that language lightly. On this show, it was a fantastic thing to start with the concept of steampunk, or to start with a concept, I suppose, where the style was a rich one that, I could just pluck elements from and refashion into something that was going to work. But to have that strong idea there from the beginning was terrific.
Laurel Frank has been making the amazing Circus Oz costumes since the late 1970s. On ABC Radio National and online, you're listening to the Artworks feature. I'm Suzanne Donisthorpe, and I'm investigating the wonderful world of steampunk. Over the last couple of months, there's been an online forum called The Great Steampunk Debate, with questions like, what place does ethics and ideology have in steampunk? How relevant is the punk element in steampunk? Gender in steampunk? Race in steampunk? And it's been a very lively debate with lots of long comment threads. Lots of people with much to say, not all in agreement by any measure. Catherine Wilson, it's a complex community, isn't it?
It's a hydra-headed monster and a fantastical one in the true sense. I found that it's a really cross-ideological form, and that's why there is all this debate. In one sense, I think the debate's fantastic, but in another sense, I think it's a shame, because when I set out to first interview Steampunks, I was hoping that this movement had some firm political manifesto. And I remember...
That's very utopian of you, Kath.
Yeah, it is. And I remember that one of the first things I wrote in my notebooks was, I wish steampunk were less copper art and more Chomsky. And now I wish the opposite, because I really think that the movement's been put in a position where it has to reframe itself according to an international gaze. And if you read steampunk blogs online, you'll see that this is an incredibly common story. The steampunk participant was happily working in his or her workshop or shed at home, making these objects, these whimsical, fantastical objects. They went online one day and saw there was this steampunk movement, and they thought, oh my God, that's what I'm doing. I'm part of this movement. And so they have their blogs and they have their conventions, and that's all great because, they're engaging in virtual communities and critiquing each other's work, and that's gorgeous.
And sharing each other's work in vast detail too.
Yes, that's right. And they're sharing DIY tips, and it's a beautiful thing to hang around steampunk and hear their banter about, re-sleeving electrical cords in shoelaces so they look like old cables and so on. It's a lot of fun, but at the same time, I really think that once steampunk became unleashed from the DIY maker's home and projected onto this worldwide gaze, it started having to present itself and justify itself in ways that I don't think are entirely genuine. There were critics who criticised steampunk for being politically quietist or suburban or bourgeois or misunderstanding the past. And far and wide, the steampunk reaction to that is, well, we're just having fun. And yet you get forums like Steampunk magazines who make these grandiose claims like, we seek to take the levers of technology away from the technocrats.
That's very futurist, isn't it?
Yeah. And you're left wondering, well, how is case modding your computer doing that, really?
Or making a ray gun.
Yeah.
Or a brass Game Boy.
That's right. And I think it's a shame that, very often when you talk to steampunks or you go onto these forums, some, not all, but some start singing from the same international playbook. And you start to think, well, actually, I think it's more than what you're saying it is. It's indulging in your private whims and personal impulses. And in that way, it's a really sublime expression of humanity.
More spiritualist than political.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of a shame that we have this gaze upon it.
I was interested to hear some of the bizarre reflections of the past. I mean, there was a part in this great debate that I was reading about some steampunks who take on the manners and form of the Victorian aristocrat, and then others that take on the manners and form of the Victorian worker. So, reenacting the kind of old class war. And in a way, I mean, all those arguments that were so much a part of the Victorian era, like, the class situation, sexism, racism, I mean, all empire, colonialism, I mean, every kind of wicked-ism that was to be had was there and then at that time. So it's difficult to go back and mythologise a time when it was really so different from how it is today, and every one of those certainties have been blown apart in a kind of postmodern way. But then, does it matter?
It's been criticised for being nostalgic, and nostalgia is often used as this byword for conservative.
Yeah.
And I think steampunks see nostalgia as using the past as a source of critical reflection. And so they use the good aspects of the past. I mean, you'll see that even those who role play as working class will romanticise what it is to be working class.
Go home to their plasma TV after a long day of being a chimney sweep.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, you're not going to, when you revisit what's in retrospect right about an era, you're not going to revisit the grisly bits. I think that's important. I think that's an overlooked component of nostalgia that steampunk is all about. I mean, it is a fantastical genre, so I think it can be taken too seriously when looked through neo-Luddite goggles.
Brass
neo-Luddite.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting is the that you alluded to before, that business about the makers and the people that buy. Because online you can buy any amount of steampunk paraphernalia, but there's a sort of sneering disregard for people who buy bits and pieces as opposed to the people who make it. People who make it have an authenticity. People who buy it are Johnny-come-latelys that are really not part of the genuine, authentic movement.
Yes, well, you can't have one without the other, really. If you want a cottage industry, you have to have someone
To buy.
to supporting that industry. And again, this is why steampunk isn't oppositional. Many of the people I interviewed accept commissions for one-off objects.
So they're artists, really, in that respect, aren't they?
Yes, but then you get into a tricky business. The products of steampunk are often not commodity forms, so you could see them as art in the pure sense. And on the other hand, if you subject them to criticism, looking through your art brass goggles, they won't live up to that either. They don't tend to operate.
They're not very original, are they? There's a kind of trope that you must form. You have to use particular bits and pieces to get the aesthetic right.
It is a style. Yes, that's true. If you were to subject a steampunk object to an art gaze, it wouldn't live up to it because it doesn't operate within curatorial endorsed discourses. If you subject it to an engineering gaze, many times a steampunk object doesn't work, or it's
over-engineered.
or it's absolutely
Deeply
over-engineered.
But purposefully,
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the favourite steampunk objects universally is the corkscrew. Do you know the corkscrew?
I have seen the corkscrew. It is spectacular.
It
Just
is.
Describe it.
It emerges almost out of the ground in this coffin-like mahogany case, and then this...
And it's huge.
It's huge, and when the brass contraption emerges out of this case, it has something like 1,000, pistons and pivots and cogs and everything, and in the end, all it does is opens a bottle of wine.
And it pours the wine into the glass. Come on.
I beg your pardon, it pours the wine into the glass. So, over-engineering is kind of steampunk's shtick. In a way, it argues against the super efficiency of modernity. So the objects of steampunk don't actually operate under any of those gazes. In that way, it is subcultural.
So therefore, in a way, it runs around on its own brass cogs. Steam-powered cogs to play with us like a beautiful toy or a magical being. It's, I don't know, it is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's also about the rise of the amateur, isn't it?
Yes. It is about the rise of the amateur in the best sense of the word, in the pre-industrial idea of the gentleman amateur, the dilettante, who the roots of amateur means for love, doesn't it? And so the steampunk practitioner does things out of love. And I think post-industry, when time became inseparable from money, amateur lost its high status and began to function as a rhetoric to devalue what you did in your free, uncoerced time. And so...
You're not paid for it. It's not worth anything.
No, it's not worth a thing. And so, the steampunk re-embraces the idea of the amateur. And the amateur in the Victorian age was still something celebrated before the feelers of mass production really got into every aspect of culture. So, yes, it is an amateur form and it does celebrate amateurism.
So in the end, it's a kind of massive contradictions, isn't it?
It is. It's the contradictory nature of modernity that steampunks are dealing with. It's an apolitical political movement. It's an anti-consumerist industry. And it's an ahistoric reenactment. But above all, it's capricious and it's amorphous and mercurial. But above all, it's whimsical. It's a fantastical, whimsical response to the world.
Catherine Wilson is from the Institute for Social Research at Swinburne University of Technology. Her special subject is low-tech social movements, and she was speaking with Suzanne Donisthorpe. Now, if you want to have a look at that giant corkscrew that they were talking about, there's a link to a video of it on the Artworks website.